Welcome, everyone. We are so thrilled to have you all join us for today's event hosted by the Living on Earth Book Club in partnership with Orion Magazine and the UMass Boston School for the Environment. I'm Leah Penniman. I'm the founding co-ED and farm director of Soulfire Farm and author of Farming While Black and Black Earth Wisdom. Soulfire Farm is an Afro-Indigenous centered community farm committed to uprooting racism and seeding sovereignty in the food system. We raise and distribute life-giving food as a means to end food apartheid and reach over 50,000 people each year through farmer training for Black and Brown growers and other programs. Living on Earth has been bringing us fascinating and inspiring stories and conversations on climate change and the environment for the last 30 plus years. And today's Living on Earth book club event promises to be as compelling as ever. Our host tonight is executive producer Steve Curwood. Steve is an award-winning journalist who has worked in public radio since 1979 and launched Living on Earth in 1990. Today, we are delighted to bring you a conversation with Camille Dungy, the author of a new memoir, Soil, the story of a Black mother's garden. I personally delighted in Camille's recounting of her 7-year odyssey to create a biodiverse garden in the predominantly white community of Fort Collins, Colorado, and in the face of homogeneous policies that restricted what was allowable to grow. In Soil, she weaves together her personal story with the eco-political stories of Black people in a way that's beautifully vulnerable, tender, and riveting. Our ancestral grandmothers braided seeds into their hair before being forced into the bowels of transatlantic slave ships. They believed against odds in a future of tending the earth and believed that their descendants would exist to inherit the seed. Camille is one of the stewards of that seed legacy. She knows that while the land was the scene of the crimes, the chattel slavery, the sharecropping, the racist violence, the land was never the criminal. She remembers that we are part of the earth and not masters over it. One of my favorite lines of the book is when Camille intervenes to protect a honey locust, saying, "Don't hurt that tree. Trees are people too." Camille is also the author of the essay collection, Guidebook to Relative Strangers, Journeys into Race, Motherhood, and History, and a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award. She has edited 3 anthologies, including Black Nature, 4 Centuries of African American Nature Poetry. Her honors include the 2021 Academy of American Poets Fellowship, a Guggenheim Fellowship, and an American Book Award. She is a University Distinguished Professor at Colorado State University and poetry editor of Orion Magazine. It's now my honor and pleasure to welcome our Living on Earth host for this event, Steve Curwood.
Well, thank you, Leah. This has to be one of the busiest times of year for you, right? I mean, you got springtime planting and turning things over and getting those old weeds out. So please, thank you. We want to thank you for taking this time with us today. And actually, all of you there, please accept our thanks for joining us. And excuse me, just to prove it is spring. Yes, I'm sneezing here. Now, before we start, I want to remind you that we can't do this without your support. So if you can, please consider sending us a donation. You go to loe.org and click on donate at the top of the page. Every little bit helps. And we're very happy to say that we can give the first 20 people who do donate more than $60 copies of Soil, which is, again, this beautiful cover. And so this is your chance to connect to, well, let's face it. She is one of the most powerful writers going these days, Camille Dungy, and we're really fortunate that we have her here. And again, a reminder that we can't do free events like this without your help. But let's dive into the conversation. Camille, you there? Can you snap on your camera? We'll see what we got going.
That's me. Hello.
Hey. Now, this book, and I just was waving it around. They tell you never judge a book by its cover. Well, that's the case here. I mean, the cover is wonderful. I like seeing these flowers and butterflies and romanticized rosy things. But as with so many stories that do come from uh, the African American and Black experience, there's some difficult truths behind all this beauty. And but that's what makes this book so wonderful, right? That it is a way of telling this story, weaving together uh, in a real way what goes on with racism in the past and present and the climate disaster, and at the same time to say, okay, um, just like Leah Penniman pointed out a few moments ago, the soil can supports us. It brings us beauty. The soil didn't exploit black people. Beautiful plants themselves didn't exploit us, and so it's wonderful to see the vibrant beauty that can be drawn from the soil by black and brown hands too, our own black and brown hands. So, Camille Dungy, welcome to Living on Earth.
Thank you so much for having me.
And congratulations for this, and thank you, by the way, for all your work at Orion Magazine, which has also helped us put this event together.
It's always a pleasure working with them.
Well, you provide such great oxygen in the world of poetry, which is so important. Even though the plants, of course, they want carbon dioxide, but for what you do,
We need the oxygen. So,
so I know we're looking at you in your study, but if you showed us outside your window and into your garden, what would we see right now?
well, right now it is almost spring. I live in northern Colorado at 5,000 feet elevation. So we're a latitude relatively close to New York City, but an altitude that is significantly higher. And so we haven't had a week of nights above 40 yet, but we've got some tulip greens coming up. I've been seeing hyacinth in other people's gardens, and I just saw some crocuses popping their little heads up, and some of the blue flax is starting to shoot out from the ground. So we are in the start point. I think I saw some sunflower starts in the sunflower patch also. So it's that beginning time.
How does that make you feel?
I love it. It's my favorite time. I only had about 15 minutes today before I had to run off to campus and do some work on campus. And I ran out and checked on the peas and put a couple seeds in places where they wanted to be. And it's an exciting time for me.
Oh, that's great. So, gardening is not exactly the easiest thing to do, as you chronicle in your book. It doesn't hurt to have an extra back, for example, so
I
many
feel
times. So, what
like
got you into
one
gardening,
of
though?
the
It's
okay.
really. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to step on
No,
that.
you
It's
go
just
ahead.
so.
You keep going.
No, I'm just saying it's hard work, and you have a very busy schedule. So, how did you get into this?
How did I get into gardening?
Yeah.
I think I have always loved the green of growing things. I feel that sort of partnership with plants provides, oxygen in the space and can feed you and creates beauty. And so that's always been wonderful. When we moved into this house, this was the first house of my own I lived in long enough to really make substantial changes. And it was really clear to me from the moment that we took residence in this house that I really wanted to be part of returning the landscape to a water sustainable, native, as much native planting as possible to support local pollinators and just get a little bit more to look at. When we first moved, it was really a monotonous palette, and I wanted more color, more life.
and getting it to have life. wasn't particularly easy. There's a funny scene at the beginning of your book when somebody backs up a truck with soil that will actually grow things, and some obviously a little bit of, uh, of things to go along with it, and but it's about to be winter. I mean, you were really determined that you and your partner were really determined to garden here, I gather.
Yes, and also I cut it really short. Ray, my husband, kept asking me all summer long, when are we going to start on this pollinator garden that you keep talking about? And I'm like, oh, we'll do it. We'll deal with it. And I kept having excuse after excuse. And then I called for that soil delivery, and it came on one of the windiest days of the year. And our windy days often happen when the weather is about to change. So the soil was delivered on a Wednesday, and that Saturday we were predicted to have a lot of snow. And so we had to really, really quickly figure out how to deal with this dirt. In that case, like at that point, it just felt like I had just created a catastrophe very, very quickly before the snowplows came and the wind blew it away and all of those things.
Well, I have to, I don't know how many times you skate at the edge of disaster in this book. This is not an easy enterprise, huh?
Yeah, I mean, I
Um,
feel like we could bring Leah back on, and that isn't that part of what it is. Also, though, to really be connected to the land, there's as much catastrophe and as many mistakes and more rain than you expect and less rain than you expect. That's a kind of oh, for me, it's a really important lesson in terms of control, what I do and do not have control over, what I can and cannot ask of the world, in terms of giving something exactly as I want it. And so that skating on the edge of catastrophe can be really harrowing, and often is, but it's also for me really instructive and oddly soothing sometimes. I wonder if I should keep talking. If Steve comes back, oh, okay, now you're back.
yeah, I'm so sorry we're having so much trouble with the circuit. So yeah, well, talk about skating at the edge of disaster. I didn't mean to bring it so close to our conversation here. Um, as an author, you get this question all the time, but how do you answer it in this case? Why did you write this particular book?
That is a really great question. This is not the book I thought I was writing. I thought I was writing a book that may, in fact, have aligned more closely with some of the conventions of nature writing I was raised in. And those are conventions that leave a lot of the people out and just look at the land and the animals, and kind of a solitary figure has all the revelations they can in connection, in their personal connection with the natural world. But I was writing this book during 2020, and all my plans, as happened for so many of us, all my plans for the book, for my life, for my days, just changed abruptly when my daughter's school system sent all the children home, and I became the one responsible for overseeing her remote learning for the year. And so my time was moved in all kinds of directions. I had to figure out how to balance my writing with the needs of my daughter and my family, and that kind of care. And I had to really reckon with that particular convention that suggested that the wilderness was someplace far away, that nature was something way outside our door, and that the roles of human experience and culture weren't relevant and important in environmental writing. And so I really shifted over the course of the year of writing this book into thinking about how important interconnection really is, and how necessary it is for me to acknowledge that perpetual interconnection between me and the greater than human world, my family, and all the complications of history and culture and society, how they play in. It became a very different book as a result of that.
So, I mean, in the middle of this, of course, you're homeschooling your daughter. You have to, right?
I had to.
Yeah, I mean, there's no choice. So, um, how did that affect this process? In fact, um, how did she get woven into both this learning process around this and well, I'm sorry, just tell me how did this affect this whole process for you?
Well, my daughter is a delightful human being. And so, in many ways, it was a real pleasure to have that opportunity to spend time with her that I would not have been able to spend with her. But it was really hard. It was really hard to keep everybody fed, to keep everybody happy and safe during that time. And it was often really eye-opening to see the lessons she was learning and the ways that she was being trained and taught through the school curriculum, often in ways that were very similar to how I had been, and wondering over and over what new lessons might be possible to help us create a more sustainable, equitable, vibrant kind of world. And so that was one of the things that, I play at some point in the book with thinking about the word that we use for a particular kind of agriculture is conventional agriculture, but that conventional agriculture uses a lot of poison and does not, in fact, work in synchronicity with the soil and with plant cycles and with beneficial insects and birds and pollinators. And why is that the convention? And so, and it doesn't have to be. There are plenty of other traditions and experiences and millennia of lessons that if we open our view into parallel histories, give us many other opportunities for peaceful, prosperous survival.
Well, I brought up your daughter because, in some respects, your story is about the family and the garden, and I mean, you reach back, things that you remember about your grandfather, for example,
Great grandfather,
and that your great grandfather, pardon me, things that you remember about this, and how for so many years this people have been connected through family to the land, although so many of us don't have that connection anymore. Food comes from the bodega, doesn't come from the yard. Even a tiny, I don't think a lot of us, of course, Leah Penniman's a great exception here, get to grow lots of food, but the very act of having something that you can kind of go out into your yard and grab and either put on the table to look lovely or put on your plate to help make breakfast, lunch, or dinner, and that the family is there in this process is really wonderful. And you paint that picture with all of its complications, that you have in the family. When I don't know if it's fair to ask you this, but when did you realize that this was as much about you and your family as the garden?
That is a great question, Steve. I think my writing process during that time and during the very any particularly busy times usually is a kind of recording process where I just dedicate a certain period of time. And so in 2020, I called this my 2020s, and I just allotted 20 minutes a day, even in the most busy day, to just write down in as much with as much sensory detail as possible everything that seemed important to me that I noticed. And because I was so connected during that time and being rooted here, what the figures who kept showing up were my family, and they offered me ways of understanding interconnection, interdependence, the friction that we sometimes have, even with people we love. All of those experiences felt honest and true to what it means to be trying to build a beneficial relationship with the environment around me and also with the community around me, right? With my town and with my state and my country also. And so my family just, they were part of my way of telling this honest part of my life.
Um, let's switch tacks here a little bit. You at one point in your book you write that let me see if I can get the quote right here. Whether a plot in a yard or pots in a window, every politically engaged person should have a garden, which of course in part reflects your experience there in uh, at near the University of Colorado State University there. Um, because of the rules and regulations in your town and some of the politics, frankly, about setting up your yard the way you would like to have it. So maybe is it fair to say that your garden was a bit of an act of revolution?
I think that is fair to say. It's still oddly um, not as common to find native plantings in a lot of suburban developments. There's still a sense that the the kind of look, the aesthetic of cleanliness and refinement does not include like winter brown growth still left up in April because it hasn't been warm enough yet to remove the last winter's things. And so there's a way in which my yard looks unkept and it looks kind of scraggly and it's full of brown and wild things that are often considered weeds and not a kind of rangy rowdiness in the plantings, which since I happen to, my family is the only all Black family in our neighborhood, and we're one of just over 1% of the whole city's population identifies as I actually love this census identification. It's Black alone is is what the census identification mean, which means not of not mixed race, etc. But when you look at that and it's 1% Black alone, you're like, yeah, that is that sounds about right. But then in a space where there are often preconceived notions about what Black people do to a neighborhood, what they do to your property values, what how well they'll keep their house and their land. For me to then have that yard, which is that way because I'm using native plantings, because I'm using low water uh, processes, because I leave those winter things up a long time so that the overwintering beneficial insects have a safe space. Like there's a reason that I'm doing this, but that still doesn't fit this particular kind of cookie cutter aesthetic. And it's hard to not, right? It's hard to say I'm going to be different in that way also in a community that doesn't, the people don't look like me and the yards don't look like my yard.
And it fits into a stereotype. If Black people move into the neighborhood, it's not going to do so well.
Yeah, yeah. So, there's a kind of a risk there. I'm lucky when we first moved into this house, there were codes for the HOA about, maintaining a standard looking yard of a certain sort. My town, Fort Collins, Colorado, has begun to do some really active efforts towards increasing low water usage in yard plantings and encouraging native plantings and such. And so the homeowners association and the town have moved in the direction that I was already in. And so I'm lucky, but there are people all over the country who do end up with really severe fines for making these kinds of decisions, who come home and have their whole home, their yards bulldozed by the city, right? That there's stakes for making these kinds of decisions in your yard. It's not just about decoration. It becomes political. Returning all the way back to your question about every political person, I think there's a statement. June Jordan was famous for saying it often. Every time I walk outside my door, it's a political act. And when I walk outside my door and make decisions about what I put in my yard, that becomes a political act.
Well, I think at one point you talk about getting fined for the appearance of your
I
place.
did get fined. I had my green bin. My compost bin was visible, and it should have been, that's the guard. You can't have the compost bin visible because that's not attractive to see that.
Ooh, shocking.
I know.
Very shocking. Oh, my goodness. But on a more serious note, with a range of acceptance, shall we say, from the Fort Collins community, you're also in the middle of America, and you're in the Front Range, because there's a lot of, well, you talk about the trauma that's going that in your book. I mean, police violence, of course. What happened to the Sand Creek massacre of the Arapaho, the Cheyenne, and not to mention the hotel down the street that was the basis for the movie The Shining. No, but more seriously, you had fires coming out of the park, coming down the hills towards you.
Very
Right?
close. They got very close.
So, why was it important to you to include all of this alongside writing about your garden?
Yes. I have to return to that statement I made earlier that I wanted to write an honest portrayal of what it meant for me to try and build a more sustainable and diverse landscape around me from the ground up, right? That this was not just a frivolous act. This is something that really required a digging in for me. And part of why this was sometimes not easy is that in the time that I'm trying to do this, all these other things that you're describing are happening, and they're not They can never be far from my mind. Sometimes I can't go out and garden during the time at the center of this book because I couldn't breathe outside. The smoke was so
Yeah.
bad that it was impossible to be outside. And yet I am inside and I'm sheltered and I'm relatively safe in that sense. But the sweet birds who nest in the big tree in our yard, they didn't get away from that. And so I'm watching them trying to figure out how to cope with this human caused catastrophe that is catastrophically disrupting their existence. I didn't think I could honestly describe the world that I was living and the world that I was working to make better in my own little corner, right? Without honestly and directly talking about the many traumas in the present and this foundational history that were swirling around me all the time, are swirling around me all the time.
Yeah. I mean, this is present. This is present moment. I mean, not an easy, never an easy time, as you, so many things that you point out. It's never been particularly all that easy, but even more challenging right now. Um, Talk to me a little bit about though the patience that all this required. Your garden was not exactly an instant project, despite the the truck that backs up early on to get things going, or the fact that you needed. At one point, it sounded like you could have used a jackhammer to get down through what was
Oh, the
left of it.
soil here can be miserable to work with. It's clay soil. So it's really, when it's dry, it's really, really dry. And what's left behind, under heavy Kentucky bluegrass sod or the river rocks that were the other ways that this yard had been landscaped, the hardscape, like underneath that, it was just compacted clay, like just hard, awful. And yeah, I broke tools trying to get through it. It was tough. And the garden is never finished. I have a giant project that we're about to start actually next week. We were going to start it yesterday, but then it almost snowed. And so we didn't. That's Colorado for you. So it's this ongoing process. And I think, again, returning to that question of why I think a politically engaged person should have a garden, and also like a clarifying note that when I'm talking about a politically engaged person, I'm thinking about anybody who has a vested interest in the decisions that we make as a culture towards how we want the future to look. Anybody who has a vested interest in that, and has some sort of takes action in those directions, you're a political person. And so that's what I mean when I say any political person. And the garden, because it's ongoing, because the process just continues, and every year there's things that have to be done again, and every day during the height of growing season, there are particular kinds of insidious weeds I have to look for daily and pull out and deal with on a regular basis. That kind of constant care and constant attention reminds me that anything that matters will require that kind of constant care and attention. So anything that I want to do in the world, any place that I want to see more beauty in the world, or more diversity or more sustainability, I don't get to just do it once and be finished. I have to return. But here's the blessing that the garden also gives me: that peace, that quiet, that full, robust life, the beautiful smells, the sounds, all those lovely birds. I get joy. and pleasure and a kind of reciprocal grace from having done that work. And so that the garden's great for that. The garden just reminds me that this is not easy, but it does pay off.
They say a weed, of course, is just a plant in the wrong place.
Yeah, that's my dad. He says that a weed is just a plant that's growing in a place or a way you don't want it to.
Yeah, but you had a lot of those. I
Yes.
think, yeah, and I think you tried some cardboard to see if you could bump them off. But those weeds, they are able to make their way up through everything. Talk to me about uprooting, really, things that need to be removed and uprooted as a metaphor, really, for societal change.
You asked earlier about something about how I saw this book manifesting, and at what point I realized certain things. I had already written a couple of responses to the 2016 elections and describing what happened in my house the day after the election, and then in the week after the election, and then right after the inauguration. And I had written those pieces, and they felt very important to me, and that's in some ways describe also what was going on outside in my yard and things. But then I was out gardening and had to pluck some bindweed from around the stem of some native blue flax, and you have to do this process very carefully, because bindweed is it'll grow any old way in any old place. You put a little tiny piece of bindweed someplace and it'll grow. You pull it out in the wrong way and it redistributes itself. And I realized that bindweed could work very well as a metaphor for the kind of noxious actions, behaviors, and political courses that put my body, my family, and so many people who I love and care about at great jeopardy. The thing about bindweed that's very interesting is that at first it actually looks very lovely. It looks appealing and attractive and wonderful at first, and then it will kill anything that gets in its way. And so that was a realization about how I understood some aspects of the world around me with the help of the things that were growing in my garden and the ways that I have had to learn how to deal with that.
Yes, bindweed it literally chokes things.
Mm-hmm.
It just chokes things after looking so good. It just chokes things.
And tears them down, right? And just pulls them
drags
down.
Them down.
And like...
Drags them down. And so at the end of the day, how does that really help the bindweed? You know, it makes itself a parasite in a way on other plants, but if it's successful in its parasitism, it destroys the basis that it has. So I guess it has to find another set of plant victims to keep going or something.
Right, I guess, but it just keeps spreading and spreading and spreading.
Yeah.
And it finds a new place, and yeah.
Yeah.
I had a lot of fun doing, it's like interesting to do research on these kind of things that by the time you get the book, you get the benefit from what it was that I learned about all these plants. But often it was a process for me to learn how deep the bindweed can go, and which is an important thing in this kind of water scarce place, that it can outcompete for water and etc. Go ahead, Steve.
No, no, I think it's I think it's a powerful analogy to what's going on in our society. That there's certain weeds that are not considered desirable that nonetheless are very powerful, and if left unchecked, can destroy all kinds of things, including the things that it would seek to take over. It's very strange.
And at the same time, there are certain plants that are called weeds because often they're indigenous plants. They're native to this landscape, but they didn't cattle don't do well around them, or they don't work well in a bouquet, or they don't last very long, or for some reason they are not commercially viable, essentially, and so are therefore not desirable and are turned into weeds, but they are often the most beautiful plants in my garden. And when I allow them to prosper in this space, the kinds of life that I see coming to those plants is just, it's thrilling to me to see how many native bees are like, this hasn't been here for a very long time, and just are all over the place, excited for these native plants that have been called a weed. So I, even though I feel like there's not much good that I can say about bindweed, I am very careful always about what I call a weed, what I call undesirable, and how I engage with those plants. I say in the book that I end up trying to pay more attention to what I want to grow than what I don't. And in fostering and filling the space with as many beneficial plants as possible, I kind of crowd out the noise and allow more of the beauty and possibilities for variety to manifest.
Um, we'll move on from weeds in a moment, but I just have to follow up. No, because one of the things you point out, there are, quote, weeds, according to local lore, that are native plants. And one reason that they're, quote, weeds is that they didn't go with the non native cattle that the settlers brought to the Eastern Front. This was not a place for cattle, and yet, in order to have that whole meat system, these plants were considered, in some cases, even toxic to
Mm-hmm.
cattle. So it's in parallel, really, with uh, paying attention to all the things that need to live in a space, and that who is in fact, elbowing their way in, and maybe not the most ecologically sound way. Shall we put it in that way?
I
Um,
feel like you can put it in that way.
yeah, there's a. Uh, so let's talk about repairing the distance that people have put uh, between themselves and nature, uh, and how you found such an antidote for that in this process of gardening.
Yeah. Well, one of the distances that I have seen in the environmental canon, particularly the canon of nonfiction prose, is like I it's like this kind of really odd absence of mothers, of women who are mothers. And I continuously confused by that absence, and what it suggests about separating the domestic, what happens like inside a house, from this other sort of wild landscape, that those two can't work in conversation. And I think with that sort of failure of imagination, where we haven't seen particular kinds of people, particular kinds of bodies, particular ethnicities, particular sort of genders and positionalities in those spaces, it erases the ability for those communities to be seen doing the work they are doing. Doesn't prevent us from doing the work, but it prevents us from being seen doing the work, and being disappeared and erased from conversations makes it more difficult for broader actions and broader kinds of understandings to manifest. And so to me, it just became really a kind of fascination that I couldn't let go, to keep thinking about why this erasure and why that erasure, and to who benefits from these erasures, and what are the ways that we are missing out on all kinds of possibilities for successful, really positive progress by not having these kinds of experiences in the conversation.
Leaving race aside for a moment, you talk about Mary Cassatt among the Impressionist painters. They were all dudes, right? You know, you've got Matisse and Van Gogh and all those folks. And oh, there's one woman in that crowd. And yet, I can't believe that she was the only person of the female persuasion who had an eye and was painting and, you know, had plenty of work that would have been worth showing.
Yeah, she also happened to be extremely wealthy. So that helped for her, right?
Well,
that
exactly.
helped her have the freedom and the time and the support and the clout to be able to do the work that she needed to do. She could not have, as a woman, done some of the things that the male artists were able to do to just make, survive and make it. She had to be independently wealthy in order to do this work, right? And so it's all interconnected, class and gender and race and whether or not how many other people you have a responsibility for. Mary Cassatt never married, never had children, which, as I say in the book, and I fundamentally believe this is every person's right to make their own decision as that is concerned. I just noted during that period in particular, when I was home with my daughter, how different my life looked than my two child-free friends who I had a regular text chain with, and what it was they were able to do with their times and their days, and what I was able to do with my time and day were very different. And we all got books during that period. It worked for all of us in a way, but it had to work differently. And so the artists I talk about in this book are artists I admire and thinkers I admire. And I can admire a person and also ask questions about what the conditions are that have allowed them to be where they are differently than so many other people who might have experienced something different.
Yeah, I mean, just bringing it home here to America for some white nature writers, a lot of freedom for Annie Dillard, right? Mary Oliver, even both white privileged women writers. Of course, there's always John Muir to think about. Um, so I found myself wondering, uh, is that part of what has what's loosely known as the environmental movement on sort of the wrong foot because we don't consider motherhood? We don't consider the ecology of families as part of place, as part of putting down roots, being able to grow things. Um, that you know that we focus too much on the rare bird and maybe the specialized habitat that they have to have instead of our own habitat, the way that you have made your habitat a refuge for pollinators and such, to dare to grow. In other words, might this effort at trying to change our society's approach to ecology need many more people like um, Leah Penniman, growing with family. I mean, one thing about her Operation Soulfire Farm, it's not isolated people, but they are together as in families. I'm just wondering if your book is maybe picking up the edge of that question and really
Oh, I think I'm
asking.
digging right into the center of that question. I don't think I'm picking at the edge. I'm not picking at anything. I'm digging in, and I'm in this. I'm in the heart of it. In 2009, I collected and published an anthology called Black Nature: 4 Centuries of African American Nature Poetry, which the central argument there is that for 4 centuries, African American people, or Black people in America, because some of these were so early, Phyllis Wheatley, the first Black person to publish a book in the English language, have been writing with an environmental consciousness, but they have been excluded from the core of the environmental canon, often because the writing was also talking about history or economics or violence or state brutality or any number of other things that then made it another kind of poem and not a nature poem. And with Soil, I'm doing a similar thing. Is this actually a nature book? Because it's about a garden. It's not about a perception of kind of wilderness, which is often what people think about when they think nature writing.
Mm-hmm.
Is it a nature book? Because I'm talking about my husband like going on long bicycle rides as opposed to talking about what's going on in the garden. And I'm talking about my family's history someplace else. Can that be a nature book? If people are trained as I was trained, my kind of environmental literary education of 19th and 20th century American nature writing suggested to me that the way to be a nature writer is to go out into the woods by yourself and just look at things for a long time and then write about it in incredible solitude. If that is the only way to engage with the world, with the greater than human world, with the natural world, most of us can't do it. Most of us do not have access to that kind of space and time. Most people do not have the ability to wander away from their families for days, months, years at a time. Most of us have to have a deeply interconnected, often urban or suburban, high populated sort of life. And you know what? You can still be deeply engaged with the greater than human world. You can be deeply engaged with your natural landscapes. and be living in a city and be living in a suburb. And until we work on this aspect of the American imagination that has somehow been allowed to believe that nature always means out there, away, someplace far away, the catastrophic, that's our word for the night, Steve, like really
No,
deeply
it is. It's bad news now. Yeah, it's
deleterious state of the planet cannot be amended. Because what are those aways? Those aways are so often places where either they're very frequently places where people of color live. They're very frequently places in the global South. They're in places of lower economic means. They're in places where there's a lot of women with children and all the things that we know about what that means economically for people. The away often means in other people's backyards. And I just feel like it's really, really important in my yard to make a stand against that kind of destruction and to make a space instead of welcome and connectivity and possibility, and to serve as an example of what that kind of consciousness can look like.
Wow. I found myself as you were discussing that, even Henry David Thoreau had his mom bring him food. I mean, this is a myth that somehow
it's a fantasy that has been cultivated and created and can only work if you have a bunch of people to support you, right? I write in the book about Muir, as I say in the book, bless his Sierra loving heart, but also the ways that he is allowed this permission to go off on those rambles and walks for so long, and what his wife was doing at home, and what his children, and what his cook, and what his brothers and the people who were tending his orchard and his yard, all of that support system made it possible for us to have all that work by Muir. I didn't have all that support system, but I still think that I have some things that are important to say. And how do I then write a book that shows you that instead of erasing that shows what it means to live a full life and also be active towards environmental repair?
Well, I found your book and forgive me, we are a little bit over time, but I can't bring this conversation to a close yet. So my producers are going to start hopping up and down probably soon. But I really found your book an amazing invitation to get out of the elite view of all of this and live with it at home. And, from your statement that everyone should have a garden because it's a political statement, but that political statement is that we're equal. We don't have to be rich to appreciate all of this. I mean, it was hard for me to read about John Muir because, he pushed so hard to remove red people, Native Americans from the national parks, right? Oh, you can't have a national park if there are Indians in it. Of course, Teddy Roosevelt himself said that the West would not be won until it was rid of the red, yellow, black, and brown man. And
we need to know this, right? We need to talk about these parts of our history because so much thinking comes from past thinking. And until I look clearly and carefully at those realities, often complicated, that have shaped the land I live on. And until I look at the ways that by living in my subdivision in northern Colorado, am complicit in a certain way of the ongoing disenfranchisement of, right? Like I have to talk about that. I have to look at that. I have to be honest about that. We all have to be honest about those parts of our histories and our presence.
Yeah, I mean, your university where you're based as a university professor, Colorado State, very strong reputation as an environmental school, and yet your experience of living in that town disclosed rather limited diversity.
Right, right. And also, I mean, absolutely true, and lots of really like not pleasant, send us into the house and keep the doors locked and the blinds shut kind of things happening. And also really wonderful friends, really great neighbors, right? Like those things can be true simultaneously. I worry about a kind of way of portraying the world that can only hold the beauty, can only accept and absorb the good parts. Because I've just never experienced a world where it's just all good parts. I've always experienced the kind of Janus head maybe of society that means that sometimes I find friends when I open the door, and sometimes I find people who want me gone. And when I'm writing my reality, I therefore feel the need to be balanced in those depictions.
Yeah, and of course, what's happening to you there in Fort Collins, Colorado, is not unique for the United States of America these
No,
days.
not at all. There's nowhere
mean,
I could go. There's nowhere I could go where these things wouldn't be happening.
So, it's funny. You get to play with your title, soil, because, of course, it means transforming dirt into something that's productive with all the living organisms. But it's also a verb that we use to make something dirty. Say it's soiled.
I'm a poet, right? I mean, I trained as a poet. I love language. I love the multiplicity of language. And I love the ways that some words in our language offer just that kind of multiplicity that I was talking about of experience, that the same word has both. And then the one thing that I would say about soil that I find fascinating is that you're right. Like when something is degraded, we use the word soil, but also when I'm thinking about why it was important for me in this book, even when I'm writing about the wonders and the splendors and like the joy of my garden, to include that like huge wildfire that we had, to include the COVID epidemic, to include the 2020 police violence and related uprisings, to also include those things. Good soil has absorbed and transformed rot and decay and feces and death. And it transforms those realities of the world into a material out of which new possibilities can grow. until I acknowledge those realities and figure out how to absorb them into the soil of my being, there's no way for me to have fertile soil to grow imaginatively and personally.
We are way over time, but if you have time, let us continue. I mean, we have a couple of questions. Is that all right? Do you? I don't know what your
I would
schedule's.
love questions.
Okay. So, person named Barry says, in the face of the systemic racism we live in, and in the smaller scale, your homeowners association rules, did your so-called unkempt yard offer any opportunities to get to know your neighbors who were curious uh, about what and how you were growing?
That is a great question. Was it Barry? And yes, it did. I write about that some in my book, about conversations I had with neighbors about um different plants and animals that were coming up in my yard, and why things were showing up in my yard and not theirs, and other kinds of conversations. It is a good conversation starter for people. And also, I'm outside a lot. I'm outside tending the yard, which puts me in a position to say hi to people as they're walking back and forth. And that too makes a possibility for connection, just being in that space.
So, somebody named Heather is asking if you have a favorite poem that you have written relevant to this conversation that you could share with us in this moment. And I mean, we could ask if you would like to read a poem. And actually, there's a passage that we'd also like you to read. But first, the question: is there a poem that you would like to read?
Well, I included poems in this book, so
Right,
it
of course.
is a
But
it's a
which?
book
So the
length
one.
narrative, right? But sometimes I think more clearly in poetry, and so throughout the collection, you'll find my own poems scattered that are other ways of seeing these questions that I'm thinking about, and also photographs that were taken by a dear friend whose flowers grow in my garden, who I sort of saved some from a one of her homes, and a dear friend and my daughter and an photography artist named Dion Lee all worked together to make photographs too. So um, I was interested in that sort of multi-genre aspect that feels to me similar to the diverse landscape that I'm trying to cultivate. Was there a particular poem, Steve, you wanted me to read?
Well, actually, I have a passage that I'd love you to read, if you don't mind.
Okay.
So, if you would make your way to, let me make a note of what page we are on for this. I think it's page 38 of the galley that
Okay.
I'm looking at here.
Okay.
If you could start there with Jillian's skin is nearly the same shade as mine. Just give us the setup, and then I'd like you to wrap up at the top, right next to the top of page 40. There's just one more line on that.
Mm-hmm.
That to bring it to a close.
Yeah, I'd be happy to do that. Um, the the setup is simply that I have been trying. There was all that river rock that I described, and I pull it out, and then what do you do? What do you do with this rock? And my friend Gillian, who also works at the university, was taking it for her dog run. And so then I have to coordinate with her, and Gillian comes over with her big old Land Rover and collects it. It's a nice symbiosis. Gillian's skin is nearly the same shade as my own, a color I replicated as a child with the burnt sienna crayon in expanded Crayola boxes. We have similar gold red undertones, and we both wear shoulder length locks. Each of us has been mistaken for the other in this town. Over the years, as plants we've swapped take root in one another's soil, our yards have grown to resemble each other's as well. While we lift many pounds of rock into the bed of her mud-cake Land Rover, Gillian tells me stories of her work as a wildlife ecologist, studying the effects of climate change on communities in Montana, Alaska, and farther out into the world. She collaborates with these communities as she collaborates with me, devising positive and sustainable changes for our homes and the planet. After removing the rock, there is still work to do. I find plasticized landscaping fabric laid down to prevent the growth of undesired vegetation. Compacted by years of the weight of crumpled granite, dirt, and clay coat both sides of the heavy material. It's difficult to grip. Some clay-caked rocks continue to weigh down the fabric. I use my whole body to tug the material out of the ground, sometimes ripping or cutting it free from the large sheet still stuck under rock-filled sections I haven't yet cleared. I am drenched in sweat by the time a day is done. Efforts to reduce natural diversity nearly always result in some form of depletion. What I find once I clear the beds of rock and fabric would be of little use to a garden. It is hard clay packed so tightly that its impermeable solidity resembles the escarpments in the famous Red Rock Parks and Amphitheater an hour south of us. To break up the clay and build more welcoming soil, I amend the newly revealed areas with compost magicked from kitchen scraps, cold barbecue ashes, the garden's deadheads, and fallen leaves. Our 2 tumbling compost barrels provide one to fill with waste we might have otherwise tossed into a landfill, and one to leave alone so rank scraps can mellow into dark, crumbly, earth-smelling compost. When I amend new beds, I also add topsoil hauled in from a landscaping supply store called Hageman Earth Cycle. I love the environmental vision inscribed in the name Earth Cycle. The earth, all we do and are here, is part of a cycle, a beginning that leads to an ending that leads to another beginning again. I love climbing Hageman's small hills of soil, the product of years and years of interconnected growth, decay, digestion, and excretion, promoting more growth. I shovel some into a wheelbarrow to haul home in our Honda. The full body participation in promoting an ecologically vibrant landscape excites me.
Such a lovely section. There is, we have fans here who want more poems, if you don't mind. I mean, there's one, of course, that speaks to, although you don't mention ever the cottonwood trees in it. When I read it, I thought that I would see them tumbling around about my feet. It's on 155. You call it Clearing.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
That
so,
particular tree also has, it's like it gets kind of messy with its white petals at a different time of year than the cottonwood also. Yeah,
okay. So
yeah.
just, would you mind reading us Clearing, please?
I'd be happy to do that. Clearing. All night the wind blows, and my mind is like the hawthorn that loses limbs. They litter the ground, crush the black-eyed Susan, scatter buds over rows of lettuce, bean sprouts whose greens are clusters of worry in raised beds. Blown leaves and cracked limbs threaten our foundation. Water backs up in gutters, seeps into the house's walls. But my mind is not in the house. In the yard's far corner, the eye of my mind rests on a hawthorn branch, shaken, snapping, hectic, then still. The day dawns without anger. The blue jay I've looked for pushes sky off his crest. How splendid his wings and tail. It's not so much that before this he'd hidden himself. It's only he favors a roost I could not see until the storm thinned the tree.
So,
There's the hawthorn. Like my daughter's
oh
hand,
yeah,
the little hawthorn
right,
branch
yeah,
there.
your daughter's, yeah. All right, one more maybe. Um, so, and let's go to the politics here for a
Okay.
moment. On 217, you, you talk about, just being down the street or down the hill or down the mountain from Rocky Mountain National Park, and all the protest. As you write, you say, actually, let me just say what your introduction to this is. For editing purpose, I'm just going to go back for almost. So there's a poem I'd like you to read on page 217, and you introduce it with the words, "In her mostly white town, an hour from Rocky Mountain National Park, a black poet considers centuries of protest against racialized violence."
All right. 2 miles into the sky, the snow builds a mountain unto itself. Some drifts can be 30 feet high. Picture a house, then bury it. Plows come from both ends of the road, foot by foot, month by month. This year, they didn't meet in the middle until mid-June. Maybe I'm not expressing this well. Every year, snow erases the highest road. We must start near the bottom and plow toward each other again.
It is a cycle, isn't it? It is a cycle. I think that we are up against the clock seriously now. So,
Thank you. What a great conversation. I really appreciate your wonderful
well,
questions and the audience's questions.
well, what a wonderfully powerful book. The questioning doesn't seem adequate to really tease. No, to spend the 2 or 3 days that somebody really ought to spend with this, just to understand all the dimensions of the metaphor of soil that this has, of what makes us dirty, of what allows us to grow, of what we need to think about in different ways, and what's alive. Because at the end of the day, of course, soil itself is alive in its own way with its microorganisms. So, I just want to thank everyone for joining us tonight. Again, just a reminder that we can't do free events like this without your generous support. And we are giving away copies of Camille's book. You can see it here. A Black Mother's Garden, the story of a Black Mother's Garden, Soil, Camille Dungy. I don't know. Are you next going to be poet laureate of Rocky Mountain National Park? Of
Colorado. I did once
Colorado?
have an artist residency inside Rocky Mountain National Park. That was a lovely thing. I don't know about the poet laureate of Colorado. The poet laureate of our nation is a wonderful person who's just signed on for another 2 years, and I am thrilled about Ada Limon in that position. So I'm not
Yes.
chomping at her position in any way right now, but I don't know. My goal is always just to write the best work that I can write, and hope to get it, share it with as many people I can. That's really my main ambition always, is to write work that moves people in many different ways. And I'm happy to hear that Soil did that for you, Steve.
Well, thank you. What a gift. So, yep, we are out of time. And I just want to thank you, Camille Dungy. The book again, called The The story of a black mother's garden, Soil. Officially being published on March 2nd.
No, May
But
2nd
available?
on
I'm sorry.
Tuesday. It'll be
What's with my
Tuesday.
brain?
Yeah.
Yeah, officially being published on May 2nd. But you don't have to wait. You can get it now if you want. All right. Okay. Bye for now.
Bye. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.